Thank you everyone for coming. We're thrilled to have Dr. Mary Mendenhall here, who's an associate professor of practice of international and comparative education at Teachers College. And her current research interests include policies and practices of refugee education across camp, urban, and settlement context. We had a really interesting conversation earlier about the urban side of that, which is coming on. She works on teacher support, professional development in crisis settings, including the use of mobile technologies and the relevance of sustainability of education support, international displaced children, and conflict states in sub-Saharan Africa. She also done work in Latin America and the Middle East, as well as the exotic learning lab known as New York City. I came across some interesting pieces about the two of you on refugee, which are quite interesting, I think. 3 years, Dr. Mendenhall led teachers continue professional involvement in national teachers working in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, and we've had a number of readings assigned to you, mostly about that effort. Over the next 3 years, she'll lead a research team working on a new project in Uganda and South Sudan through an EU-funded initiative called Building Resilience in Conflict Through Education. And it came up at lunch for those that was your assignment.
Not just me, but thank you. Yeah. It was a tough one. Yeah, it was.
Dr. Mendenhall serves as a member of the Standards and Practice Working Group for the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies and helps lead the network, lead the work of the Teachers in Crisis Context Sub-Working Group, which is an interagency effort to provide continuous quality professional development to teachers working in displacement context. She also serves as an advisor to the Right to Education Initiative and the Center for Learning and Practice at the Carey Institute for Global Good. She earned an Ed.D. in International Educational Development with a specialization in international humanitarian issues in 2008 from Teachers College, an MA in Higher Education Administration from New York University, and a BA in Psychology from Ohio University, down at a bunch of her home state.
Yeah, any other Buckeyes in the room? Yay. Thank you so much. It sounds like you had as much fun with that RFP as we did. I still look back at that proposal and think, what were we doing? It was a beast. It was an exciting opportunity because it was multi-year funding, right, which is quite rare in the humanitarian sector. And I'm part of a big consortium that received one of 4 different grants. So there are 4 different consortia working under the auspices of that particular RFP. So I'm glad you had fun with it. Today, I guess, you heard a little bit about my background. I really do kind of scholarly side, I have my practitioner side, and increasingly I feel like I have an advocate side. I find it possible to do this work and not get upset and not want to affect change in any way possible. So I think you'll probably hear both my enthusiasm and my frustration a little bit in today's presentation. And if nothing else, I hope it fires you up in terms of whatever work you want to do in the humanitarian realm or in the development realm or any other pathway that you choose to take. We need to think about the purpose of our work. We need to make sure that we're not doing it independently, actually. We need to think about how we're collaborating with those that we're seemingly trying to help to make sure that the help is actually what's needed and what's relevant. So I hope some of that will permeate this. And if you don't hear it, challenge me on it and check in with me about how I try to engage in more participatory approaches or thought more reflectively or critically about this work. I definitely don't have all the answers. There's a lot of challenges and paradoxes and contradictions in this field, but that's also the beauty of it, right? Trying to rationalize and figure out how to move forward. So thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed the lunch discussion and some of the discussions I've been having with faculty throughout the day. It's exciting to be down here in Philadelphia on this beautiful, sunshiny day. As you heard in the introduction, I have been, working quite extensively with teachers for quite some time, but it's not just that, but I will kind of narrow in on that a little bit today. So just so you get an idea, I know these are going to walk back and forth between these screens. Just to give you a sense, I'm just going to set the stage a little bit for how I'm thinking about this work and kind of situating the work and what's happening in the field. I want to talk about different dimensions of teacher support in these settings. And I don't think it's limited to humanitarian settings. I think it's relevant for development settings in many cases. I want to share with you a little more detail about this Teachers for Teachers project that we developed and implemented and researched in Kakuma Refugee Camp, and then kind of zoom back out again and think about where the field is going, how you guys can help us move the field forward. And then you sent me an overwhelming number of really tough questions. So my plan is to actually just talk until the entire time so I don't have to answer them. So we'll see how it goes. They're not going to let me do that. They're going to flag me, hopefully, and let me know when I should wrap up because I can get on my soapbox and keep going. Okay, so that's a general arc. So we're just going to dive in because I know time is precious. So when we're thinking about education and emergencies, and we're thinking about teachers in crisis contexts, all different types of teachers, and I'll explain what I mean by that. We've obviously had a number of different development goals over different eras and different decades. Now we have the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a very clear emphasis on quality education, right? It's about getting kids into school and making sure that they learn. It's making sure that marginalized and vulnerable groups are getting into school and learning. So really thinking about a much broader sense of access, quality, equity. So that's exciting, right? There's more room to grapple with refugees and internally displaced populations and other marginalized and vulnerable groups that are historically left policy deliberations, funding, et cetera. Okay, so that's one just big picture global thing. The next, when we think about refugees and displaced populations, is we already have a very, relatively clear, we can argue over, how well it's implemented, but a relatively clear set of humanitarian laws and refugee laws and human rights laws and frameworks protect the most vulnerable, right? We have legal platforms, legal standings, legal conventions to help us, argue and advocate and fight for the right to education, the right to work, the right to move around, etc. This could be a whole semester, right, just on that slide. We're going to do it in like 10 seconds. So just thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, thinking about what we already have in place in terms of legal frameworks, and then this contradiction of we have that, there's some promising things happening in that space, and yet we're still confronted with, record levels of displacement globally, right? I think you've seen these numbers probably in your classes already in terms of how many people are forcibly displaced from their homes, either having within their country and being moved or crossing international borders into other countries. And when we think about education, of course, we have to notice how young the displaced population is. We have to notice how long people are displaced, right? And so we've heard, and I'm sure talked about in your classes here, there's a lot more emphasis and importance placed on the role of education, getting kids back into school sooner rather than later, because we will miss the entire educational life course of a young person if we don't, right? So lots of interesting momentum around trying to recognize the importance of education in this, despite the huge challenges that we're up against. And the challenges are real. This is a picture of a primary school in Kakuma Refugee Camp, which is in Kenya, and I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. You can see these statistics, right, from the UNHCR about how many refugee kids are getting access to primary school. 61%. There's some pretty significant improvement, actually, in that statistics over the last 10 years. 23% at secondary level, and then a precipitous drop at tertiary, right, 1%. But this is really about access. These numbers are about access. These numbers aren't about retention, academic completion, achievement, learning, right? So these kids have access to a primary school, right? They clearly don't have a place to sit. They have, one teacher who's responsible for all of them. There aren't enough teaching and learning materials. That doesn't mean learning can't happen in this space. It is remarkable what teachers can do in some of these environments. But I don't think this is what we're advocating for, right? So trying to think about how to overcome some of these challenges. So we have all these global frameworks and sustainable development goals about the importance of education, right? Lifelong education, quality education. It is amazing to me that we actually don't talk about teachers very much in those debates and dialogues. And yet the research suggests and shows in many different ways, in different contexts, that teachers are the strongest school-level predictor of learning, right? So why aren't we paying more attention to teachers? Why aren't we thinking about how we can better elevate the profession of teachers and support them in terms of our policies and practices? Right? This is where I start to get fired up. And before I kind of dive into this a little bit, I can't possibly do justice to all of this in the next 45 minutes. But thinking about all the different dimensions of what we mean by teacher support, right? There's the teacher management dimension. This is my kind of categorization of these things. But the teacher management side of things, the teacher professional development side of things, and the teacher identity side of things. And I'll explain to you what I mean by these. So for teacher management, it's big stuff. How do we recruit teachers? How do we decide where they go in terms of deployment? How do we retain them? What types of policies and benefits and other conditions are allowing teachers to remain teachers? How are we compensating them equitably so that they actually have a living wage, whatever profile of teacher they might be, right? So that's a big bucket. Another big bucket would be professional development. And I heard somebody say today at lunch, we can't call it teacher training anymore, we have to call it teacher professional development. And I love that because it isn't just about training workshops, right? It's so much more than that, and we have to own that and do better. So, what does pre-service and in-service look like? What does continuous professional development look like, whether it's in the form of mentoring, form of coaching, whether it's peer-to-peer or expert to teacher or seasoned teacher to emerging teacher. What could that look like? How are we recognizing and validating the incredible amount of time and skills and expertise that teachers do ultimately develop through certification? What's the role of teachers and better supporting teachers, and also kind of upskilling in terms of what we need them to do to support teachers in today's context, particularly in displacement contexts. And then teacher identity is also another kind of big bucket. Well-being, and all of these are intersectional and multidimensional and incredibly complicated, but we need to keep them in mind, right? So well-being is a lot of things. It's about, have they been compensated? Can they actually get a living wage? It's about their self-efficacy. Do they feel that they can actually do their jobs as teachers and have the confidence to do that? Are they motivated to show up every day? Are they resilient? Are they able to exert their own agency in asking for what they need in these spaces? And I'm not saying all of this happens very well in any particular context, but these are things that we need to kind of wrestle with. I cannot do justice to any of these buckets in the next 40 minutes, so what I am going to do is kind of focus in on the teacher professional development bit of this in the next few minutes. But I do want you to keep in mind, you can see it, sorry, it's probably small for those in the back, different profiles of teachers, right? So again, we're still thinking about this in a refugee or displacement setting. So we might have host country national teachers who now have refugees in their classrooms, right? We might have refugee teachers who are already teachers pre-displacement who want to continue working as teachers now, or they have been newly recruited as refugee teachers and are getting exposed to interesting professional development opportunities. And we might have internally displaced teachers who, again, are moving around their country of origin but have been displaced from their home community. And while that doesn't seem to, logically, well, that shouldn't be such a big deal, they're still teachers within that country, they're still, certified, they're still getting compensation. That's not always the case. All those things are not necessarily recognized, they're not necessarily paid. So we can't make assumptions about the different profiles of teachers. So keep those in mind as we continue. So what's really challenging as we think about teacher professional development is those different profiles of teachers, particularly refugee teachers or newly recruited teachers who are coming into the mix. And unfortunately, we had this great piece by Mary Burns and James Laurie a few years ago that really tried to take stock of what was happening with teachers in the field of education and emergencies. And what they found through all of the literature and all of the key informant interviews that they conducted was that where it's needed most, in these displacement contexts with limited resources, newly recruited teachers, professional development is episodic, its quality is variable, its duration limited, and support or follow-up for teachers almost non-existent. Okay, now again, this will depend on the profile of teacher. When the Syrian crisis erupted, a lot of the displaced persons were already very well-trained teachers. They had gone through, had a college education, had master's degrees, had years of experience as teachers. There was, an immediately available group of people who could step into that role. In East Africa, where I'm more familiar with, most of the teachers who were recruited in refugee settings graduated from high school, and that is what's making them eligible to become teachers. And they desperately need, a heavier dose of teacher training, right? So it's very context-specific in terms of what's happening in any different country. But by and large, we're finding that we're just simply not catering enough to the needs of teachers working in crisis contexts. And this is just like a little bit of a side note. I felt like I couldn't talk about my work without talking about a much larger initiative that I'm a part of. I almost was going to put like an acronym page on the first part of my slides because I have the alphabet soup in this world of work that we do. You've heard about IEDP? Yes, raise your hand if you know what that is. Yeah, so it's the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies. It's a global network of NGOs and UN agencies and academics and refugees and a very diverse group of people who came together back in 2000 who said we've got to collectively, argue and fight for the right to education. And there are different working groups and different task teams and people coming together around particular issues. Several years ago, a group of us created a work stream, which they now call a collaborative, all these different names, I don't want to overwhelm you, called the TIC, Teachers in Crisis Contexts. And we came together because of this quote, and we came together because in reaction to this quote, NGOs and UN agencies and all these different contexts that are faced with crisis were again recreating the wheel every time, creating new sets of teacher training materials, new types of coaching and mentoring ideas, many of which were very good, but we were wasting resources, right? There's some fundamentals about being a good teacher that can be shared across contexts. Yes, they have to be adapted. Yes, they have to be contextualized, and we need to figure out how to guide people in that process a little bit, but we don't need to recreate the wheel every time. So this group of kind of like-minded agencies who are working in very different contexts came together to create kind of a shared set of competencies, a shared set of training materials as an initial starting point. And later then added on more around coaching, more around monitoring and evaluation. Now we're developing a research and learning agenda and advocacy platforms, really thinking that we have to work on all cylinders to affect change for teachers in crisis contexts. So I just wanted to kind of give a shout out to this group because I'm part of this group, helped found the group. My students have helped develop all the things that I'm going to tell you about in the next few minutes, and along with vetting it with these different actors and the teachers that they're working with who have then picked up the materials and wrestled with them and made them more relevant to their context. So just wanted to kind of situate this. The next slide I think might be a little overwhelming, especially in this room, and it might be hard to see. But one of the things we initially were coming together to look at, again, was notions of professional development. What does that look like? Why is it important? What does it take? And so we wrestled with trying to create a theory of change. I'm sure you have seen theories of change. They're complex, and now I'm going to show you one that's just as complex, probably. And you probably absolutely can't see that in the back row. But I'm just going to walk you through it for a second, just so I can kind of anchor my thinking and your thinking about how this larger teachers group is trying to reconcile some of our work. Because I showed you those dimensions, right, of teacher management, teacher professional development, teacher identity. It is hard to work on all cylinders. And so we tried to start kind of with some clarity about teacher professional development while still recognizing some of these other dimensions and push and pull factors, right? So down here, we know that different NGOs, and it's not meant to be prescriptive, everybody's still doing different things, even if they're adapting the same pack, which I'll tell you more about in a second. So we know different agencies are doing teacher professional development. They're doing training, coaching, mentoring. They're asking teachers to connect through tablets and do self-directed learning. They have mobile and online learning. There are different ways of supporting teachers, right? And different organizations can figure out what makes sense for them, what kinds of resources they have, what the caliber of their teachers are that they're working with, and how to adjust the needs to that, right? The TIC, and I'm sorry, I'm going to say the TIC a lot. The TIC came up with these different competencies, very obvious ones: teachers' role and well-being, pedagogy, curriculum and planning, child protection, well-being and inclusion, and subject knowledge. Thinking about what are the needs of teachers in crisis contexts. Again, always to be adapted, always to be contextualized, but at the fundamental level, what do teachers need to feel like they're teachers and to feel confident in that role in the front of the classroom? And if you start to layer in those fundamentals, then you get teachers who understand core teaching competencies and pedagogical knowledge, right? We recognize, this is all based on the literature. We have a whole separate document that cites all of these buckets, and I'm happy to share it. But looking at the importance in the literature and from our individual work around the world about teacher collaboration, what happens when teachers actually talk to each other, realize they're not alone in their struggles, realize that they're able to get help immediately from a peer. They don't have to wait for the NGO expert or the consultant or the teacher trainer to swoop in. They have people right there in their immediate setting that can be helpful. And then you start to kind of work up this theory of change, right? There's stronger self-efficacy, right? Confidence in your ability to do your job, resilience to overcome the inevitable obstacles that will come in these settings, well-being and a positive sense of self, and motivation to continue to persevere. That ultimately then leads to this enhanced teacher professional identity. And we are very clear that all of this we're trying to influence and shape and I don't want to say standardize because it's not the right thing, but building on the same kind of fundamental learning that we know from different settings ultimately gets to teachers who are delivering higher quality instruction and creating safe, positive learning environments, right? Now we know that if you do this well, and we need more evidence to document it, that ultimately you'll get at better student learning. But we're deliberately saying there's this accountability ceiling, right, this dotted line, where there are other factors that are going to affect student learning. It's not only and all about teachers, right? So we want to take responsibility for what we can do with teachers and recognize other things that would help or hinder learning. And we're also recognizing you can do the best teacher training and coaching and research that you want on teacher professional development, but if the policy context is the opposite of that, you're going to have a struggle, right? So we're recognizing the influences of coordination and recruitment and compensation and certification and other things happening there. On the school community side, we're recognizing, again, maybe have an amazing teacher who has a horrible head teacher, who is abusive, who is discriminatory, and is going to impact that teacher's ability to do his or her job or remain a teacher, right? What are the working conditions in the school? What kinds of resources do they have access to? How are families and communities engaging, right? So this is a living and breathing document. We keep wrestling with it and disagreeing with each other and the literature and the evidence about this. But this is some of the work and the critical thinking that's coming out of this Teachers in Crisis Context Working Group. And we'll continue. It'll probably look really different in a year from now. So check the IEE website or email me and I'll tell you what we wrestled with and what we overcame. But I wanted to share this because what we ended up doing in Kakuma was kind of predating the development of this theory of change, and it was informing kind of back and forth the work we were doing in the field and the thinking that this teachers group was doing. So that brings me to Teachers for Teachers, right? This is this project that started percolating many years ago. I was sharing at lunch that I used to work with the International Rescue Committee, and I had a really interesting opportunity to work with the University of Nairobi when they were developing a master's program for education in emergencies. And some of that training and capacity building for the faculty involved a research study on the state of refugee education in Kenya. And that was my first time going to Kakuma, and this was back in like 2009, 2010. And I just walked away kind of stupefied at the very low quality of teacher support in a camp, which you'll see in a second, has been there for a very long time. And felt very compelled as I'm like, I'm a faculty member at Teachers College. I might have something I can offer. We've got amazing people who've worked in this part of the world. We have partnerships with local organizations. Is there a way that we could help elevate the way we're thinking about support to teachers? And because of the protracted nature of that particular camp, funding was starting to, thin out. It was harder to raise funds for a camp that had been there so long. So anyway, there was some early inspiration about what could we do to actually respond to what, at the time, I perceived as a need based on the research that we were conducting. And so Kakuma, I don't know how familiar you guys are with the different refugee camps, but Kakuma is on the border with South Sudan. There's another even larger camp, Dadaab, that's on the border with Somalia. Both of those camps have been in existence since the early 90s, right? So you're going now on third generation of people being born in these camps. The numbers, fluctuate in Kakuma, and there's this other settlement now called Kalobeye outside of Kakuma, which was meant to actually be a really innovative local development resettlement scheme that's becoming another refugee camp for other political reasons that I can explain in Q&A if needed. But an incredibly diverse camp where the majority of folks are coming from Somalia and South Sudan, but you have refugees from many other countries, as you can see on this list. So how is a camp that's been there since 1992 still struggling to support teachers in that particular setting, right? So I was a little baffled by that, to say the least. Here's just like a quick overview of education in Kakuma and Kalobeye. 21 primary schools serving 75,000 students. Do the math, think about the teacher-student ratio, how few girls are accessing education. Actually, they're significant. This number, 73%, is quite impressive for a refugee camp in terms of primary school enrollment. But then look what happens at secondary, right? We drop from 21 primary schools to 5 secondary schools. So 2% of the young people are getting access to secondary in the camp. Incredibly kind of writ large underqualification, underprepared teachers, and the majority of whom are refugees. There are Kenyan teachers who work in the camp, but they are the minority. Yeah. So you can imagine, you saw the one picture of the overcrowded classroom, the lack of training, which I've already made really clear, refugees, the teachers and the students dealing with the ordeal of being displaced or having been born in the camp and still being there, not knowing what the future holds. Their refugees are considered incentive workers. They're not legally allowed to work in Kenya, but they're given an incentive compensation by UNHCR and the NGOs working in the camp. And a number of other challenges, right, that you can, that aren't surprising probably to you. I won't read all of those in one by one, so just take them in for a second. All right. And, this idea that teachers, they feel the lack of support very acutely. Here is a quote from one of the male teachers who was from South Sudan. And maybe I know some of you might have seen me present at this. I always kind of use this quote. But he says, "Yes, I'm happy to be a teacher, but with a condition. If I can get training and prove that I'm a teacher, that's when I will tell that I'm happy to be a teacher. But as for now, I have not yet known the sweetness of being a teacher because I have not been trained." Right? So they feel this. It shows when they're standing in front of their classrooms. It shows in how they engage in classroom management. It shows when they're trying to think about the pedagogy or the content knowledge that they're trying to impart. And if we're able to start to change that, the changes are quite significant, and I'll allude to those in a moment. So I gave you a little background a few minutes ago about kind of where the inspiration for this project came. So in 2015, Teachers College, through me obviously, was able to partner with UNHCR and other local agencies to create what we thought would be a more responsive, relevant model of teacher professional development in the camp. And we got some funding initially from IDEO.org, which you might be familiar with. They've launched these different initiatives for funding, and we were able to pitch the idea out and competed with like 400 other people with their ideas, and miraculously ended up getting funding support from them and design support from them. So they actually helped us, go to Kakuma, work with teachers on the ground in the very early phases of the design work for this project. But the idea was, how can we do this better, and how can we sustain the support that we're giving to teachers? It was very much rooted in the literature about what we know from non-crisis contexts. We have to keep that in mind. Knowing that training is not enough, knowing that there need to be other layers of support built in, whatever form or function they might take, and in this case, coaching and mentoring. And I'm just going to really quickly walk through each of those layers just so you can get a snapshot. I know you read the case study, so you already know quite a bit. But over the 2 years that we were able to implement this project, we had 541 teachers who participated in the training. And the facilitators initially were myself and students and local staff. Quite quickly, we wanted to turn the tables on that and have teachers co-facilitate and then ultimately lead the trainings, which is what happened, which is fantastic. That's the way it should be. They're the ones who can sustain it. They're the ones who are going to stay after we fly out and come back to New York. So initially there was a kind of a short-term training. These modules harken back to that theory of change, right? These different competencies that we wanted to get at. And we were adamant that whatever we produced in this setting could be used other places, so everything is open source. Again, this is part of the IEDP, Teachers in Crisis Context Working Group. So everything that we talk about today is open source and can be adapted and contextualized in other places. But there are different training modules depending on, again, on the needs of your teachers. Can they just get a short-term training and then get the other added layers of support? Do they need kind of a longer-term training with time in between the modules to actually practice in their classrooms? So there are choices that people can make in terms of how they utilize the PAC. The peer coaching element we thought, again, was really important. We had the luxury of flying in and out of Kakuma and spending way too much money to do so. Where's the sustainability? Yes, we have some expertise in terms of what's good teacher professional development support, but they're the experts of their classrooms. I've never taught in a classroom with 250 second graders, right? Have any of you? Anybody? Yeah. So who am I to stand up and tell somebody how to do classroom management and positive discipline when they have no resources, they're underpaid, and they have 250 eager second graders staring at them, right? So we wanted to very much recognize and respect the expertise and the day-to-day struggles and ingenuity that these teachers brought to the fore. And so this really inspired this notion of peer coaching. And so we would, bring a group of teachers together. We'd go through a teacher training. We would already see in the training room kind of some of the natural leadership kind of percolate to the surface. For all of the training and the coaching was always an open call. Nobody was obligated to participate. They were able to kind of apply and pretty much be accepted if they felt that this was the right thing for them to do. We would have applications. We would explain the peer coaching opportunity. Would you like to work with your peers? Would you like to support your peers? This is not a hierarchical relationship. This is a collaborative, horizontal relationship. And we would have peer coaches come in for another round of some training to help them kind of harness those skills and be able to facilitate really interesting conversations with fellow teachers in the camp. In some settings, I know from my colleagues are that will never work. It always will have to be somebody who's technically more senior than them, or they won't take it seriously, or the school inspectors have to be part of this. So again, this has to be contextualized depending on the setting and the needs. But the idea was about active listening and providing feedback Holding people a little bit accountable. Say, wait, did you try that? That thing that we talked about in terms of classroom management. Did you go back to your classroom and try it? You did, great. Did it work well? No, it didn't. Why not? Like really trying to tease out what was happening in the classroom or in the school community around some of the things from the training. So we had, in the end, 541 teachers who were participating in peer coaches who led TLCs, teacher learning circles, where they did just that. And again, there's this kind of open source coaching pack that can be adapted. And I know I'm moving fast because I want to stop talking and hear from you guys. And then there was this other layer, mobile mentoring, because we thought, okay, we bring them together for 4 days of intensive training. They get some of those fundamentals great. We know that's not enough. Layer in the peer coaching. They've got built-in local resources to work with them, but there probably maybe is still a need for some quote-unquote, and I very loosely say expert advice. So how can we keep them connected to formally trained teachers or experienced educators outside of Kakuma? They could have been in Kenya, they could have been in New York, they could have been in other places. So we created this other third and final layer called mobile mentoring. And we ultimately had 85 global mentors from 29 different countries who applied to be mobile mentors. We looked for people who had the criteria I was just talking about. They're trained teachers, they have a pedigree in being an educator. Ideally, they've worked in a refugee context. That was obviously a little harder to find. They've worked in developing countries. They've had some exposure to, an atypical, in their minds, classroom or experience. We were successful in raising funds to give, if teachers didn't already have smartphones, give them smartphones that could use WhatsApp. They would have air and data time to be able to communicate with their global mentors. We had a mentoring curriculum that the mentors were able to push that connected to the training and some of the things that were happening in the peer coaching conversations. And this would go on for a number of months, right? So there were multiple ways for teachers to get help. They could pose questions, the mentors could push curriculum reminders or tips, they could meet in their TLCs with peer coaches, right? So there were these multiple kind of integrated layers of vertical support with global mentors and our team, and horizontal support with peer teachers in the Kakuma setting. Definitely challenges with the S down there, multiple challenges. We were, looking back at that theory of change, right? We're kind of unapologetically saying we're gonna look at teachers. We know student learning is important, but we have to start somewhere. And the first place we're going to start is teachers. And so that kind of permeated our work at Kakuma, where we privileged teacher data. And so for a while we kept saying this was a challenge or limitation. I'm like, yes, it is, but we don't need to apologize for it necessarily, right? The teachers are the ones that we're trying to work with and understand their perspectives about. We want to hear from them in lots of different ways. But of course, eventually we need more. We need to know what's happening with the students and their learning. We need to hear from other stakeholders about kind of the effectiveness of this particular approach. Initially, obviously, we had these different strands of training and coaching and mentoring, and we had pretty good sized numbers in terms of our reach and our sample, right? So there were suggestions that, this group just gets training, and this group gets training plus coaching, and this group gets training plus mentoring, and that group just gets mentoring. And it seemed like great, research methodology-wise, it seemed like a great idea, because how else are we going to tease out which component of this model works? But the needs were so great, and the consultations with the teachers and the consultations with the local actors in the camp, it seemed unethical to do that. And so we didn't. And we just invited everybody to participate in this model, and we were going to learn what we were going to learn. And then maybe later, if we knew we were going to be able to stay longer or do a more random kind of sampling of that, or some kind of quasi study in that sense, we would do it. But at the time, it felt very wrong, and so we didn't do it. In any place, I'm sure this comes up in your class discussions, the institutional partnerships, the organizations working in these places, it's complicated. Everybody's got different agendas. They're up against different constraints and barriers and funding gaps. Again, I think because of Kakuma being there for so long, there was a little bit of just kind of saturation and exhaustion, and you didn't see the kind of same enthusiasm that you might feel in a newer emergency, and that sounds like a very crass explanation, but there did just seem to be like, it's just the status quo. Like, it was really hard to come in and like infuse a new idea and like feel enthusiasm from some of the stakeholders on the ground. And not all. There were certainly exceptions and amazing champions in all the different organizations, but it was something that was palpable, right? We felt that. And another interesting challenge was, as teachers started to feel more confident, they started to think about child protection and how to respond to the needs of the kids in their classrooms when they would learn about sexual and gender-based violence, when they would witness in their own communities how certain children were treated by foster families, for example. They started to act. They started to become activists in this space. And then it's tricky because now they're subjected to potential backlash by the community. So all of a sudden we were trying to deal with, child protection violations, teachers wanting to, do the right thing, follow referral pathways and protect these young people, but they were embedded within a system that didn't necessarily kind of have the same standards around anonymity or confidentiality or protection. And so we were trying to help from a distance teachers who were, in a sense, putting their necks out and willing to kind of stand up for their students because of how they were feeling about the training and their role as educators. So it was a kind of unexpected both benefit that they were feeling like that, but then also consequence in terms of their own personal security. So we had a lot of things to kind of deal with as we were implementing this project. So just some key kind of quick key findings and positive developments. And sorry, the font is doing something a little different on that page. Obviously, I think you can get from me, hopefully, that we believe very, clearly, based on the evidence from this project, that we need robust teacher professional development. If we keep doing one-off trainings, we're just going to keep repeating the same cycle and regurgitating and not affecting change in the most meaningful way. We saw very clearly in the Kakuma setting that if they had better support, it led to better teacher confidence and improved teacher-student relationships, right? There was a lot happening in terms of corporal punishment and how, imagine that you're stressed out, underprepared, untrained, unsupported teacher with that many kids in your class. You haven't been, thought through how you might handle different scenarios. You don't know what the alternatives are. So corporal punishment was a kind of often go-to in these settings. When we started to address that in the training room, and we almost never were the ones to address it, that's when our local teachers, who also themselves had decided they weren't using those practices or had never used those practices, would engage in a conversation with the teachers about why they thought it was harmful, what the alternatives were, and why this was a productive conversation to have. And I'm not going to say that all the corporal punishment ended at the end of this model. It did not. But we definitely saw significant decline in its use. We had teachers who removed the cane from their room, so it wasn't even an option for them. There were teachers who were advocating at their schools for all teachers to give up the cane and to find more positive disciplinary approaches. And it was this kind of really interesting kind of virtuous circle. When teachers started to do that, they almost immediately noticed that kids started raising their hands and asking questions in class and coming up and talking to them in class, outside of class. And it was like this, I don't even remember now how, I have to look back at my notes, how many teachers made this example without our prompting about this almost immediate change in their dynamic with their learners. And it then reinforced to them why they needed to continue on this path, which was really fascinating. I think one of the bigger changes that we saw come out of this project. Again, saw the importance of teacher collaboration. So many teachers said, wow, I had no idea that we were all struggling. It's nice to know that I have somebody to ask a question to. It's nice to know that I'm not the only one who doesn't want to be a teacher, right? Those were honest responses. Localization, contextualization is really important. While the mobile mentoring was an interesting element, I'm very cautious to say that it's never meant to supplant face-to-face teacher professional development, and I can go into that and maybe more in the discussion. Clearly, we need bolder, again, multi-pronged advocacy to address some of these bigger kind of systemic issues around compensation and certification. And sorry, this kind of got out of whack, but this was a lot of the data and the evidence that we had collected that I just made in terms of how many teachers were participating in the study on the research side of things. So sorry, that was in a different order before. Somehow it jumped. And then, it's hard when you're doing this work not to feel overwhelmed by the obstacles. It's a lot that needs to happen in terms of effective change, both in terms of policies and practices, funding cycles, and obviously it's not just the teachers or other things that have to happen for the learners or in the school spaces. But there are some positive developments which I think are encouraging. And maybe you've talked about many of these in your classes, but the global compacts that have been coming out are, again, kind of elevating the discussion, getting national governments to commit to certain, shared responsibilities. We definitely need a lot more. We need more of the countries that aren't directly affected by the refugees to play a bigger role there. I don't know if you've talked at all about the Djibouti Declaration on Regional Refugee Education, an incredible document. They specifically talk about refugees. It's a number, I think 7 different African countries who are looking at this from a regional perspective. They name teachers. They talk about teacher certification. They talk about the mobility and migration of teachers, how they need to be, their certifications need to be validated, respected, utilized if they're crossing international boundaries. So really, really promising in terms of both learners and teachers. So I encourage you to look at that. Education International, which is the global kind of like teachers union, organization, they're implementing policies and making statements about refugee and displaced teachers, where they also were a little distant about those before. It's complicated, right? You've got ministries of education in every country who have their certification and their teacher training pathways. They don't want to undercut that or devalue that by coming up with alternative pathways to certification for refugee teachers, for example. But there are ways, and there are examples slowly coming out of ways to still kind of uphold the criteria and the standards and the credentials of a particular country, and then still recognizing some of the needs, maybe especially if they have a teacher shortage, how refugees or other displaced teachers could help kind of meet those needs, right? So really interesting things happening. Another RFP that came out recently by the World Bank. They are thinking about entering the fray earlier on the humanitarian side. And the RFP is about actually helping influence policy. And if you read it, you'll see a very clear call to think about teachers. They want separate policy documents and briefs and notes about teachers and displacement, right? Because they're the ones who would have a lot to say in terms of recurrent teacher salaries, right? And who's funding those in displacement context. So there's some really interesting movements and momentum around this. And then just lastly, the IEDP Teachers in Crisis Context Collaborative, started out around the training bit and saying, let's stop duplicating and replicating efforts. Now then they added the coaching. We have a theory of change. We're developing a research agenda. And in the fall, we're going to host a really large roundtable that includes Ministry of Education representatives and includes teachers, which is key, that are displaced, that are host country teachers, that are then able to represent their needs on their own and not have us interpret or relay those needs in this forum. And so we're really excited about this. We have a lot of high stakes invested in this particular event, but we have different co-sponsors who have agreed to get the Ministry of Ed reps in the room, because they're the ones who are going to have to make decisions, as well as the Ministries of Finance. That might be another layer to that in terms of paying for teachers, but it's some promising movement. And then lastly, because I know I've talked way too much, I never talk this much when I teach or give talks and try to be way more interactive. But this quote from an earlier EFA monitoring report has always, kind of struck me, and I kind of keep it in circulation. But, investing in teachers, their preparation, support mechanisms, and the means of delivery in the classroom is investing in learning. Right? We have to start somewhere, and we have to do it better than we're doing. It is a prerequisite to allow the transformative power of education to occur. So this is kind of the motivation for people like me and all the teachers in crisis contexts my partners in crime, if you will, to keep us kind of trying to fight the good fight as we see it, at least. And I'm happy to accept, critical feedback on how we can do that better, or if you think we're misguided in our pursuits. But thank you very much for listening to me. Sorry to bombard you with all that.